Welcome to In the Open with Luke and Joe. I'm your host, Luke Shantz, and here's my co-host, Joe Seppi, and a big welcome to our special guest, John Mertic. Before we get to our show, don't forget to like and subscribe. In this episode of In the Open, we're pleased to bring you a conversation with John Mertic. John is a Director of Program Management at the Linux Foundation. We will be discussing his work with the open source projects, the Academy Software Foundation, LF Energy, and the Open Mainframe Project. Before we welcome John, let's say hello to our co-host, Joe Seppi.
Hey, Luke. How are you, my friend?
Good. How are you doing, Joe?
I'm okay. It's funny. We have this nor'easter coming, right? And so I'm making plans to get some things done before the snow comes. We're expecting like a foot or more. But it's been snowing all day here. It's thrown off my plans entirely. I'm just like, at a loss.
That's so interesting. It's not snowing here yet. I was looking out the window wondering when that first flake was going to fall, but it's totally putting it's messing up my weekend plans as well. I was going to go to this microbrewery and like all these, I had this whole thing planned. It's probably not going to happen.
I know you invited me. I was excited about it.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. You were. Oh, by the way, Joe, we might have to cancel. I forgot to tell you before this. I want to tell you now.
Yeah.
And if anybody else was coming, sorry.
Yeah. Maybe next time.
They'll be on next time. So without further ado, let's welcome our guest. Hello, John.
Hey, John.
Hello. How are you both? I've heard from the preamble, one's getting ready to be cold and one's getting ready to head to a brewery.
Well, the brewery may be canceled, and I think we're
canceled.
both
Bummer.
Yeah. How about you? You're out in Cleveland. They get some snow and stuff out there, right?
Yeah, we've had all of our winter weather in the last 2 weeks for the entire season so far. It's probably about a foot or so of snow. It's supposed to be quite cold over the weekend. I think tomorrow the high is supposed to be like 14 or something ludicrous like that. The day before, my kids actually had school canceled because it was like -1 when they would have left the house. I know when I was a kid, we never had school canceled because it was too cold. Apparently that's like a newfangled thing. Right? We have friends in Minnesota that think we're nuts too. So anyways.
Yeah. I've driven across the country a bunch, and I know like every time I get around the Cleveland area, I think it's usually a little bit further into the kind of Erie and New York sort of section, but all of a sudden it's like crazy snow. Yeah, it's wild.
I've had a lot of times that we've done ski trips up to Western New York, Holiday Valley, Peak and Peak, places like that, and yeah, we've came home and just been encountered a blizzard the entire way home.
Yeah,
but the skiing was so amazing that it's so worth it. So
yeah, wild. Well, we have a lot to talk about today, so maybe let's start off with a little bit of a self-introduction, if you don't mind, John.
Absolutely. So I'm here with the Linux Foundation, and I've been around open source my entire career. I started as just a developer and contributor to open source. I worked a lot in PHP, which there's so many of us that scratched our itch in that and got really involved in the PHP community. For a while, I was actually the author of the PHP Windows installer. Was sort of my first big contribution into the open source world. From them, I spent a lot of time at Sugar CRM, both from a developer standpoint, community management, and it's also when I started to bring up some of my business acumen skills. I helped reboot their ISV program, and then I did the same thing with Bitnami afterwards. And when the opportunity to work in vendor-neutral open source foundation sort of presented itself, I was just super excited because it's a culmination is just all of the things I really love to do is just spend time with these communities, help them become successful, be an advisor, grant knowledge, but then just see the output of what amazing happens. And I think, that's something I can always just sit back on and just look and say, wow, like it's amazing where you all have came from. You came from an idea or a couple of companies coming together and say, hey, we want to do this, to you have something out there and you have downstream adopters and you have hundreds and thousands of commits and all of this stuff. And it's fascinating seeing it all together. And it's fascinating just seeing the culmination of all of those efforts.
Yeah, I can't speak highly enough of the Linux Foundation. I mean, I've been working with folks there for years and just full of really great people in general, but the work there too is just really cool. as a part of the Node.js Foundation, and then helped merge the JS Foundation and the Node.js Foundation to the OpenJS Foundation, and that's where I spend a lot of my time now. But yeah, the LF is amazing. There's so much going on there. And we have a few things that we want to talk to you about the work that you're doing in the LF.
Yep.
But I thought maybe at the outset, is there anything exciting that's kind of coming from the LF, or stuff you want to talk about there?
There's always new projects. There's always endeavors. If we were talking a year ago, I would say we host well over 600 projects here at the Linux Foundation. I said today, and we're like in the 800 range. So, and many of those are like new projects with a number of our umbrella foundations. CNCF and Open Mainframe, Academy Software Foundation, and others. So we're seeing tremendous growth in a lot of areas, especially a lot of vertical areas, and I think we'll talk about some of those. But I think the big thing that's been presented really to the open source community as a whole, it's not really a new thing, but I would say it is came back cyclical at us from a higher importance and a higher visibility, is the look at security right now. And if we, about a month ago, we all remember the Log4j the Log4j vulnerability that hit. It's not the first one like that. You turn back a couple of years, we had Heartbleed. We've had a number of these over the years. And, it's interesting because it's always easy just to poke at open source as like, well, this is just what's going to happen. Like there's no, this here and that here. And much of this has been sort of debunked over time, that you can't develop secure software in open source. And the answer is you really can. And in fact, most of the time it turns out more secure. The challenge ends up being is setting the practices within these communities to be successful at it. Because, oftentimes in these communities, you get amazingly smart technologists. Like they know their technology or they know their space. The ideas of how to best operate an open source project, that's very foreign and new to a lot of them. And that's where, we at the LF and folks like myself, they get involved, come in. But then there's sort of the security aspect. How am I being proactive in making sure that common security vulnerabilities and things like that aren't hitting my code base? And what I think is even more important is how can you be reactive to security vulnerabilities? Because the fact is every piece of code out there, it has a vulnerability. We just haven't found it yet. And it's going to happen. The real measure is how you react to it and how you can address that over time. And one of the foundations that kind of went through a reboot late last year was our Open Source Security Foundation. And they really pulled themselves back together. And IBM is an amazing sponsor of this effort. Pulled together a fund, I think well over $10 million to really go attack or hit this at scale. Simple things like the badging program that was introduced by the Core Infrastructure Initiative a few years ago, now under the auspice OpenSF, which gives projects sort of a sense of what are the practices that I need to have in my community to A, just ensure sustainability, but B, make sure that when these security things come up, I can react to them. I have the right infrastructure to deal with it, so on and so forth. But then, also sort of more proactive things. One of the efforts is a scorecard where, projects can sort of run through and sort of see what their, security, response scoring looks like and use that as a self-assessment to improve. Along with that, group is also building out grants and other programs to, either help provide infrastructure to projects that need it, from a security standpoint, or even just expertise and people coming in and helping them. So it's a massive investment. What's been really fascinating is it's now just expanded outside of just the foundation standpoint, but now we're seeing, governments around the world starting to align with it as well. The Linux Foundation was fortunate enough, we were invited to the White House a few weeks ago to speak with them. And, Jim Zemlin and Brian Bellendorf were part of that, where they talked really about, sort of the challenges that are out there in the source, the opportunity and the areas where this investment can happen. And so now we're starting to see both public and private partnerships that are contributing to this as well. That's sort of the grand, huge picture of things. And probably the average developer out there is not quite sure of how to take a lot of this in. But I think for a lot of them, just seeing a place where great standards and great guidance and advice around security is being pulled together, from a coding standpoint, from a bill of materials standpoint, from a lot of different angles, is really crucial. And it's not that it's been absent from open source, because I think a lot of people have been tackling it, but a concerted effort together has been missing. And I think this is really that first huge step forward in making that happen.
Yeah, I think that, we're really lucky as a tech community to have the Linux Foundation, as this umbrella organization for things like the CNCF and the OpenJS Foundation. And then, of course, the Open SSF, the foundation there. I'm glad we talked about this too, because Brian Bellendorf is going to be on the show next Friday.
Oh, awesome! I've set it up perfectly. He'll be great now. Yeah.
For folks who don't know, he's the executive director of the Open SSF, the Open Software Security Foundation. Is that right?
Yeah, Open Source Security Foundation. Yeah.
There we go.
Yep.
And we're hoping to Jamie Thomas, who's a VP here in IBM, and is also the chair of that board for the Open SSF. We're looking to schedule her to come and talk soon too, so that would be great. This is really, the security is just so important to be talking about right now. We're talking about it at the OpenJS Foundation, and I think everybody's working hard on it and figuring out. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's one of those things that's just best done as a community. And we see that, we preach that a lot in open sources. There's just certain baseline things that are crucial to our society. And those are what we see are being done in open source. And security is just one of those. I mean, that's not a solely IBM problem. It's not a solely Microsoft problem or Google or whomever. It's all of our problems together. And the only way you solve this is by getting everyone together to the table to work in concert with one another.
Yeah, and that's like the core of open source, right? Whether we're talking about security or whatnot. I mean, that's what we do. We work together, and then it's not like everybody works on it alone and then comes together and is like, oh, we were doing the same thing, or we went off.
Well, it does happen, unfortunately, but it's starting to become less and less, I guess.
Yeah. Cool. So what are we going to talk about today?
Well, we got a couple, really interesting initiatives that I have the fortune of working with. The first one is always one that people love to hear about, is our Academy Software Foundation. And, this is a foundation that came together a few years ago as the motion picture and visual effects industry, recognized that open source is already prevalent in their studios. And, and just like in really every industry out there, open source is prevalent all over the place. I think, there was a study done, I forget by who, might have been by Black Duck a few years ago, that just targeted the energy industry, which we'll talk about later, that asked CTOs, like, how much open source do you think is used, is open source used in your organization? And I think like 40-50% say yes. Then they actually went and did the scans and found out every single company was using it. So it's already extremely prevalent. A lot of the challenges that they were running into was twofold. How do we collaborate more efficiently together? But kind of taking a step back from that was these projects. And, some of the projects we're hosting there is, OpenEXR, which is, an image file format that is, used across the industry for animation and, high quality, images, right? One called Open Color IO, which is, for color management, across visual effects and community animation. Openvdb, which is a library that's, focused on manipulation of sparse volumetric data. But the best way that I can always describe that is if you see an explosion in a movie, it's because of Openvdb, because that is what creates it. Like, that's the volumetric data that is used to pull that off. And, these were all, and there's more Material X, OpenTitle.io, there's several others there. I encourage you to kind of check out the whole list. But the crux of the issue was these projects were heavily used, underinvested in. And a lot of it was challenges of collaborating across. One company is the owner of one of these projects, one is the other. Having developers contribute code to the other, it was just complex on IP and all of that. So the thought is let's come together in industry, create a vendor neutral, place where this collaboration can happen. Everyone doesn't have to, contribute all of their, IP in terms of like a sign off, but kind of in a more of a common setting, which is exactly how like the Linux kernel and, many of our other projects tend to work. And with that, the end game is that, we're getting more investment and you get more participation. And that's really how that whole thing came together. And it's really interesting because you don't realize how important visual effects is in movies. I mean, I think we're all used to like the blockbusters, that have so much of that catches our eye. As it turns out, the top 100 movies grossing of all time in Hollywood all have visual effects as a part of them. And you have to scroll down quite a bit. I actually looked right before the show, so I got this number right. I think right around like in the 160s, like 166, 167, you have to go all the way down there to find the first movie in grossing of all time that had no visual effects. And I think this is a fun thing we're just going to throw out to the audience to kind of ponder on, and maybe we'll get lucky and somebody will get the answer to that one. But the point is how prevalent it was, and so much of that technology common, so much of it driven in open source. Let's bring it together in a foundation. Let's make it so that all of these studios and, also vendors within the space can collaborate, more cleanly. And that's what we've seen. And from that, every single project that has come in, it has seen huge growth in either contributors, contributions, or contributing organizations. And most of the time, 2 or 3 of those.
So do I have that right? Is that like roughly the top 100?
Yeah, we'll call it that. Yeah.
Yeah, there's one that doesn't have special effects. And so if anybody can answer that, we'll put it out here for now and let it hang for a bit. Yeah. I'm curious if anybody knows.
Yes.
To build on your point, John, it is really surprising. A great example is if you go on YouTube and you look up Boardwalk Empire visual effects reel.
Mm-hmm.
That's the thing. People, you're watching a time period film and you have no idea that so much of the visual effects is set extension or doing all kinds of, or like you'll see it's a beach in 1910. Right. All the people on the beach are CG and you have no idea. It's really amazing how prevalent, even in reality television. I have friends who work in reality television and they'll tell me, oh yeah, we'll remove people from a scene. We'll do, there's all kinds of manipulation that, science fiction, of course, it's there, but you don't know that in a lot of these other time period pieces or modern pieces, there's tons of visual effects.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And to be honest, like that was always a little bit of also a challenge in the industry is a lot of those visual effects got to the point where they're some of the most costly parts of the movie. But at the same time, it's very common, a lot of the bases under them are very common. And so, as Hollywood is looking at this and thinking, okay, there's certain costs in this industry that are going to go up. The cost for talent is going to continually go up. And whatnot. They also saw that the differentiate, if every single movie out there has visual effects, there's not really a whole lot of differentiation. So, we've seen also a trend where the differentiation starts to come into storytelling and, the scripts and things like that. And, some of the actors that you have a part of it. But when you have that, then you have this very commons of the visual effects that still needs to be, handled. And this is why these studios coming together has really made it so that then the cost of making movies, I mean, yes, it's always going up, but it's not at that exponential rate. And it's able to sort of slow down that curve a little bit. While at the same token, making it more efficient so you can have more studios come online and also just more productions going out the door in general.
Yeah, I think this is classic open source again, and it kind of just surprises me. It's in an industry that I wouldn't have necessarily expected it, but when you get into it, it's like, of course, that makes total sense. Why would you reinvent the wheel? Why wouldn't we just sort of crowdsource things that everybody needs, make them better? And everybody, it's like a rising tide lifts all boats, right? It makes everybody improve. Yeah, that's cool. That's really cool.
I have one other little tangent I have to go on here.
Go for it.
So my past career before getting into startups and tech and advocacy, I was a visual effects artist.
Oh,
and
awesome.
Yeah, and sort of the pinnacle of my career was I spent 5 years at Blue Man Group as their lead visual effects artist. And sometimes we would have workflows that use Maya or Cinema 4D, but my favorite tool of all time is Blender 3D. And if folks have not, if you're interested in 3D, this thing is a remarkable piece of software, and it's totally community driven. It's really, and it's evolved over the years to become basically a full suite. It's editing, it's visual effects, it's compositing, and it's so extensible, but amazing tool. And I see they are a participant in this project, but just thought I'd throw that out there. It is powerful tool, and I think it was fringy at one point, but now it's starting to be used in real workflows, and it's a serious tool, and it's free to use. So please check it out.
Definitely do. And it's just sort of the example of the innovation that happens in that industry, as well as the great opportunity for software development careers in that community, which is something most people don't think about. They think about if my top software development jobs is going to be like a Google or an IBM or a Facebook or someone like that. But there are so many amazing development opportunities where you're just working on really interesting technologies that are very cutting edge, and so much of that is happening in the movie industry.
Yeah, we've had a few guests that are working either in like video or audio, and like Avid or whatever. I always find that really fascinating because, like you said, you think IBM, Microsoft, Google, whatever, but then you hear about like Avid or elsewhere, and you're like, oh, that's
Disney employs tons of software engineers. Epic Games, obviously, but DreamWorks. So many are employed out there, and again, it's an area where they even you don't see some of those great software engineers being at the forefront, but they're just doing some amazing work. And if you check out the ASWF site, I encourage you to look at our behind the scenes blog, where we do interviews with people within the industry, so you can kind of get a sense of like some of who these people are and the kind of the cool work that they're doing.
Yeah, very cool. I love to think about open source explosions too. I'm gonna every time I watch, I have a 12-year-old son, so we watch a lot of explosion movies. So every time I see one now, I'm gonna be like, oh yeah.
It's addictive. I can't stop looking at my kids think I'm nuts by now. They're like, hey, I know how that's made, and they're like, shut up, Dad.
Oh, that's great. Cool. We have a lot to talk about. So should we shift gears and
let's shift some gears?
All right, cool. What next?
Do we want to stay alphabetical or?
Sure.
Okay, so let's while we're talking about vertical foundations, and I would say this is an area that we're seeing a lot of growth in, just in general. I mean, there's a lot of very horizontal foundations and projects here at the Linux Foundation, like the OpenJS Foundation, like CNCF. But we're seeing a lot of, as industries are starting to embrace open source more and more, like the motion picture industry, we're seeing kind of growth in similar ones there. And one that I have also the fortunate of working with is the LF Energy Foundation, and where its focus is really of looking at sort of the big picture of energy transition that's really needed to happen over the next few decades. We're a society that, and I think everyone can agree, moving away from fossil fuels, but also, thinking about just general decarbonization is something that helps set the planet up, for our kids and their kids and people to come. Just like a lot of industries, the challenge often becomes, well, one, how do you start? But I think two, there is so much investment. There are so many tools in this space. And the problem is broad and complex across not only vendors, but power system network operators, transmission operators, government entities, and whatnot. How can you drive collaboration in this area to really help everyone start to move towards this same goal? And this is really where the concept of the LF Energy Foundation came into play, is, hey, let's solve this through open source collaboration. And, just like, foundations like CNCF and others, becoming a host of projects in this space just naturally brings the industry together in one area, using sort of that Unix mentality of, having tools that solve different pieces of the puzzle is that other sort of piece in there of, different projects coming up to, tackle different pieces of the equation, so, for example, a project that was recently launched called Everest, which is focused on EV charging and the ecosystem, around what that begins to look like. We look at another project such as, something like a shapeshifter, for example, that there is beginning to work on, some of the other components of how these, systems communicate and whatnot. Open Leader, which is focused on the ADR standard, open automated demand response for, exchanging energy models around smart grid standards, right? So you just see so many of these projects that are hitting pieces of the puzzle, but with the idea that this puzzle ends up being this global puzzle that everyone can kind of have, as it works out, you have everyone on same technologies, similar standard technologies, ways to interconnect with one another. And then it makes it really much easier to hit these bigger global goals that we're all after of decarbonization and reducing greenhouse gases and just overall being smarter about our energy consumption.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. We put solar on the house here and installed a car charger and have batteries. And I've wondered, I have 3 different systems that I need to look to see how things are working. And I've thought in the past, like, oh, I wonder, what's on the horizon for like, common interfaces and things like that for really advancing the energy industry. This is fascinating.
Yeah, and I think there's just huge chunks of things that are kind of coming together and challenges that are sort of out there. I mean, just simple things as like what are protocol translations for the various IoT devices that are out there that are handling bits of this out on the grid, right? That's in a project we have called Fledge Power, which is built off of Fledge, which is a part of our LFEdge family. Look at a project called Hi-Fi, which is, thinking about, renewable, distributing renewable energy over DC grids to interconnect with AC grids, and, how some of those pieces start to come together. Even some of our earlier ones that, such as like PowScibel, which is, focused on, power flow simulation. So, being able to kind of, gauge of like how power is flowing. I mean, electricity kind of in power has this really interesting property that as soon as it's created, you got to use it. And if you don't use it, it's gone. So there's so much that is starting to go into how can we help manage that as we're creating energy, that it's just not thrown away, that there is a path to use it. And maybe, your grid doesn't have the path to use it. Maybe another one does. And so you have a way to broker that and, shift that power somewhere else. Maybe that, hey, the grid at a certain time is not going to have that, amount of need. So maybe I pull down my energy generation accordingly. All of this sort of technology starts to come into play so that you're maximizing sort of this really, really valuable asset of energy generation. And, to do it, you have to really work globally because, like you said, once you create it, it's gone. It has to be consumed immediately. So that ends up being the largest challenge. And, there's just so much that goes into play of how to make sure you're being able to use that, that energy that's created.
Yeah, we have like a gigafactory on our roof. I don't know what we're thinking. But we create so much energy, and here in Connecticut, we're able to ship it back to the grid. And then
Right.
We even signed up for a program where I think in peak times they can take power, additional power from our batteries So, that makes sense to me. Like, and I think they do this more in Europe. I'm not sure, maybe just Germany or around, but like, a decentralized grid where we can really kind of shift things around and utilize the resources more appropriately makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And another great example of just an industry coming together, recognizing where things need to go. And I think also the important thing is there's so much regulatory pieces that are a part of this that ends up being an interconnection as well. So there's one half that's certainly the technology that's being developed, but then there's sort of the other level of, how does sort of these technologies, start to play into the regulations and the regulatory bodies that are out there, and start to kind of get implanted into sort of governance strategies towards energy efficiency. A lot of big words for a developer audience on a Friday, but it's a really kind of cool space. And I would say, and I think it's sort of the fortunate thing that I see so much across our communities is the absolute such high level of expertise that you see coming into open source. Like these aren't, not to poke at folks, but I mean, this is not the, backwoods basement developer, sort of, scratching itch, pulling away. I mean, these are, in the motion picture industry, I work with color scientists. I work with people that are the people that vote on the Oscars. I have people I work with that are Academy Award nominees, really, really strong people that are seeing open source in the direction. The same thing I see in the energy side here as well. I'm working, with, high up people within, big transmission network operators and power system operators, the RTEs of the world, the Allianders, but, also with folks in initiatives, companies such as Microsoft and Google and, IBM and others that are also, looking at like how this ties into initiatives that they're working on. So you're just seeing such a high caliber of expertise that is coming to the table. It's in a way just kind of puts you a bit in awe, right? I mean, it's kind of cool to be in the room with that sort of, those sort of amazing people. But as I look at for open source, it's those amazing people are saying open source is the path to do this. And I think that's sort of the light that, we see at the LF, of really, we talk about sometimes that open source is, almost like the renaissance of our time in some ways. And I see efforts like this that are happening in verticals, and it just kind of helps reinforce that.
That's a great. I have never heard that. I'm gonna borrow that. I will quote you when I use the renaissance of our time. It's a great
quote Jim Zemlin first because I stole it from him.
Oh, you stole it. Because what comes to mind is I think it was maybe a year ago or maybe a year and a half ago, there was that big issue in Texas, right, where there was the temperature dropped and it affected how I think it was like natural gas plants functioned, and there was this, and I'm not going to try to get into the details, but I remember listening that it was like this, kind of cascading series of events that no one could have foreseen. And the situation actually seemed like a positive situation that they had built with some, deregulation and things that were going on. But they, there were these unforeseen threats and lack of resiliency, which, in the world of COVID, I think we're seeing a lot of that, right? We've built these great efficient systems that are not very resilient in every aspect of our society. But what I love about this and the Renaissance comment is that with science, scientists publish papers and they like naturally shared ideas, and you sort of had this like group, global group think about like what's going on. But within privatization, like you kind of lost that. Like people are in these silos, where I feel like open source brings that back, where it allows you like, hey, I am working for this company and I have these allegiances, but these ideas can be shared across the industry and it's going to be better for all of us. It's so neat.
And it's action oriented, it's not, I mean, there's a lot of theory that obviously comes to the table here, but it moves things is very much more action oriented. And I mean, and to your point, many of these, things that have hit our time, I mean, to be fair, a lot of times we wouldn't envision a lot of those coming. I think of what happened in Texas. I think of 2 decades ago, would hit, much as sort of the upper Northeast and parts of the Midwest, where we had the great blackout of 2003. Which was kind of a very similar exercise, oddly enough, started, just around the corner from me here, as it turns out. but was the same sort of thing of, the understanding how the power grids came together. And I always thought the fascinating part about that was it's not really simple to flip back on a power grid. Like, you just don't like flip a switch and everything's fine. Like, you have to like bring this thing up in stages. You have to have parts of the grids that are working that help reboot a different part of the grid. Because I even remember, we have a couple like local municipal power, power facilities that were just like for just little cities, and they were able to withstand all that because they generate their own power. They don't need the outside grid, but they were sort of the ones that were used to reboot parts of the grid that were down. And so it speaks to such the complexities and pieces there. But I think it also hits to your point of where the privatization has came in, and not that privatization is necessarily a bad thing. I always hate to look at it as like open source versus commercial, but I look at it as open source ends up being the building blocks, and then there's going to be commercial solutions out there. I mean, if you look at the average application that you're using today, 80% of it's open source. And that's just, and that number goes up and down, and that's all of the pieces that are within the stack that are coming up there. So it's such a crucial part of enabling such more amazing things. And the reality is that 80% is things that are so common across a lot of what people are doing. This is where this collaboration makes sense. And I think this is where the private industry has really opened their eyes and seen, like, well, geez, I don't need to have, an expert on, not to, poke the log, for Jay example. I don't need to have an expert on, Java logging. Like, I got a library that can do that. And if we find problems in it, we can send patches upstream, but I don't have to be the one that's maintaining all of that. Right. The same thing we're seeing in the energy industry here. And the same thing we even see in the motion picture industry. And I think the cloud industry was a great way to pay forward. I mean, the top 10 cloud providers are all using Kubernetes. There's a reason for that, because that's just a common, it works really, really well. It's common and ubiquitous, and it gets everybody moving the differentiation up a level, but collaborating on such an important core at a common level. So, I like sort of the way you're looking at it. It's like we're kind of moving out of that privatization, but the privatization isn't gone. It's just that now they have a way to collaborate and build these building blocks so they can start investing higher up.
Yeah, it makes total sense from like a business standpoint. But something that comes to mind for me, and it actually, I'm reminded of talking to Chris Norville from last week about operators and stuff, and getting the city of Denver onto like a more modern CI/CD pipeline. And this conversation that we're having makes me wonder, like in your work, and I'm thinking particularly about the LF Energy stuff. Are you working a lot with government entities, and are you seeing that more of that happening in the space that you're doing?
Absolutely. I mean, energy for sure. Just because there's such, so much of that is owned by the government there. So, we have, and there's also many associations. This, I think, is very common more in Europe. I think in the United States, you don't see quite as much of this, but you see it quite a bit in Europe, where you have, academic partnerships, but then you also have, sort of other European Commission driven activities that are all sort of playing a part in this. And, at the end of the day, they're sort of looking at like where that hub of all of this comes together, because also, from a government standpoint, they're sort of looking at like what ends up being sort of the future that we can innovate forward on. And in the past, a lot of this has been done in sort of the standard space. And I think, there's definitely a huge piece for where that is going. But we're now starting to see such an interconnection between open source and standards that, being able to kind of having both driven there, but also having open source be sort of componentry of where these regulatory things are going, just makes the whole thing a lot easier. So there's just so many pieces of the puzzle, but yeah, I mean, we're seeing, and I would even say just across the LF, so many of our projects are seeing governments, groups, entities contributing, some of them not very publicly. I have one project I've worked with in the past that the UK Secret Service is actually a big user and contributor to, but if you actually look at all their GitHub profiles, it's like user 165284332. So, but it's to show that, like, hey, they're seeing as open source as a key part of driving this forward, and they know they don't have to maintain and do the heavy lift on their own and benefit from the rising tide that others have put there.
Yeah, for me, that feels like such an opportunity. I mean, I feel like governmental systems are typically so antiquated that, like, if we can modernize these systems through open source, an open source foundation, oh, that sounds great. I'm thinking about the tests that they just you could sign up for. That was very simple, and anyway, modernizing governmental systems sounds great to me.
Oh my. And probably if we want to talk about modernizing old stuff, it sounds like Open Mainframe is a great segue, right?
Yes, let's do it.
And I don't mean to diss my mainframe friends. You're going to roll their eyes when I said that. But, it is actually, though, one of the funny things you don't think about. You think so much about the cloud being a part of our society, that when you have an AWS outage, like all of a sudden all sorts of just like random stuff breaks. Like we have Life 360 for my kids to find out like where they're at. And, my wife was like, it says you're like in this place here, but I'm sitting right next to you. And I'm like, well, AWS East Coast outage. What are you going to do?
It's a reminder, the cloud is just someone else's computer. That's all.
Yes. And maintained as such. But, what's really sort of interesting, though, is the mainframe is something that even has a much more crucial part to our society. So every financial transaction that happens, so much of transportation from the airline industry to the rail industry to so many other places, so much of the healthcare and insurance, how we get paid. If you get paid by ADP, it's thanks to a mainframe. So many of those crucial parts to our society are powered by mainframe. And I have one person I work with in the project is my board chair, Len St. Lucia. He's a third generation IBMer, great guy, kind of old Italian guy. And he'll sit down and tell me, he's like, John, the cloud could go away. We'd all be inconvenienced. We couldn't get on our Twitter and our Facebooks, but we'd still kick on. The mainframe goes away. Everything falls into chaos. And he's not wrong. I mean, maybe there'd be a little bit more chaos if, everybody's Instagram went down for a while, or WhatsApp, but, we'll let that slide for now. But it is really true of how much that is a critical background to our society. And it's often just kind of that unsung hero that just kind of just keeps ticking along. Like you just don't hear about it. But it's there. And the computing power of these things are massive. Like, and I think you all being IBMers, you probably know this, like the fastest CPU chips, clock speed on the planet are in mainframes. The fastest transactional IO speed computers on the planet are mainframes. Mainframe is a platform that has, it's so interesting because like you look behind me here and I have these like old iMacs and stuff. So I kind of like get into like old tech and things like that. My wife thinks I'm nuts, but the kids love playing Marathon. So it's all cool. But mainframe is a platform that is designed around principles, and it's designed around the principles of security, availability, scalability, and performance. And the idea is that if you need a platform that can do all four of those turned up to an 11, the Spinal Tap people in the room can shake their heads and nod. This is the only platform on the planet that can do that, period. Like, not the cloud, not even necessarily like we talk about the concept of supercomputers. It's not really necessarily, designed in such a way, but this is designed to be that like backbone to so many key things in our society. And the challenge with that is that it's a platform that is, survived decades. Even us here in open source, we trace our roots of open source back to the mainframe, back to 1955 with Share, which is an associated conference that still actually happens to this day. The summer one's in Columbus, Ohio, if you're in town. But where a user group of people came together. There was a new IBM machine came out. I think it was the IBM 704. I probably got that wrong, but one of the kind of the precursors to the modern, mainframes that we would know today. And they came together and they said, like, hey, we've got to, like, let's share tips, let's share code, let's share patterns of how we work on this. Sounds a lot like open source, doesn't it? And that's where a lot of this started. And even from there, about a decade or two after that, somebody who had been going to these events said, wow, every time I go there, there's some great stuff that gets shared. But like, then if I want to find it afterwards, I'm like having to chase down to this person and that person and whatnot. What if I compile this all together and have it canonically together? That was a project called is still called CBT Tape. CBT stands for Connecticut Bank and Trust, which is a bank that has been defunct for decades now, but it goes to show you how old this project is. It was founded in right around 1970. But it's kind of like the first open source project out there, like literally bringing together code, pulling it together in a canonical tape that is still produced to this day. You can actually still send them a check in the mail and they'll send you a tape if you really want to. I mean, it's a lot easier now just to get it over the internet, but and there's really fascinating stories. I remember like some of the maintainers when they actually came into a part of the Open Mainframe project about 2 years ago. And one of the maintainers was showing me like letters, from people, because the only way you could get the code, I mean, think of this back in like the 70s and 80s, like you can just go download this off of GitHub or something. Like, I mean, some of the older people in the audience remember, like, we even back in the day, we had like 14.4 modems. Even that would have taken a hell of a long time. But you'd have to request it. And so there'd be letters of, like, I remember he showed me a letter from the US Postal Service in the 80s where it says, see enclosed like $5 check or whatever. Can you please send me a copy of the tape? Right. But if you think about it, like, so much, and I've off on a little tangent here, but so much of our modern technology, so much of how we do open source. And if you talk to anybody in mainframe, they'll say the same thing. Jim Zemlin used to joke with me, and he said, yeah, he's like, I would go talk to my grandpa about stuff that's happening in the Linux kernel. And he would chuckle at him and say, Jim, we've been doing that for like 2 decades in mainframe. That's nothing new. It's that same, everything. We have just such hereditary stuff that comes from there. But the challenge over time is that somewhat there's been some disconnection that has happened between sort of where some of the technology has gone and sort of where the mainframe space is at, because it's kind of one in the background. But what we're seeing now is a huge resurgence within mainframe. I mean, not only are the machines and hardware just becoming more powerful, more aligned with open standards. The Z15 box that shipped 2 years ago, or about almost 3 years ago now, had native, Kubernetes and container support as a part of it. Linux has been on the mainframe since 1999, thanks to work in the community and then commercial vendors like SUSE coming in there. And now we see gigantic workloads of Linux that are running on the platform. And then we're also starting to see other parts of the mainframe world, like ZOS, for example. They're having a huge resurgence focused on a technology called Zoe, which is really setting a set of interface libraries on top of ZOS to make it so much easier to integrate with modern applications. So think of it as, a REST API to your mainframe, a way that you can be on the command line in your laptop and be running, MVS commands and, interconnecting with your mainframe. There's one cool project that a person named Alex Kim, who's at Viacom Infinity now, he's part of the IBM research. He wrote, which was called, I forget what the name of it is off the top of my head, but basically it was an Alexa interface to a mainframe. Like, he used like a Raspberry Pi to hook up in Zoe, where he could like ask his mainframe questions, right? So you're just seeing so much of that modern technology hooking to the mainframe, because that's an area of such rich value. The organizations that have it are going to be so based in using, like, these machines are not going away. And a matter of fact, we're seeing them more and more invested into. But the idea is how can we interface and hook that data across? And this is the community as a whole is seeing sort of open source as sort of the way forward. So I know I feel like I've run on like a 15-minute there, but you can say how much I think this is just such a cool space.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I joined IBM almost 6 years ago, but before that, like, I didn't think about mainframes at all. I probably thought that they were gone 20 years ago, but it's amazing. And Luke and I went to the Poughkeepsie, New York facility, and saw them building mainframes, and was like, we couldn't even bring cameras in. We had to leave our phones and we saw the sheet. It's like a $3 million computer that they're putting together. It was just wild.
It is.
I remember they had this special like electronic screwdriver gun that was like, you would scan the part and then it would like use the exact right type of like torque for every single part. It was like, it was so fancy. And that was a great, I think you captured the whole mainframe like enthusiasm around it. And you talk to mainframers and you do discover that it is a building block of civilization. It really is. And like you're saying, it's not something that is like going to be replaced by cloud. There might be some workloads that you could run on a mainframe, which would do better on a cloud, but in reality, they complement each other more, right? It's like you're a bank. You don't want to put all that stuff on the cloud. You want you need your scalable app. You want to scale and maybe that's another example I've heard is like, if you think about the cloud, it's like about scaling sort of horizontal, but kind of shallow. Whereas your mainframe, I mean, the throughput and the reliability, it's just deep, right? I mean, that's why the Z comes from. It stands for zero downtime. There's literally machines that have been running for decades, and you can hot swap the parts out of them while
Every
it's running.
Last little piece of it, yeah.
And they've got extra capacity and redundancy built in. That is just like, I mean, it really is one of the greatest creations of human technology ever.
Yeah, you can't really blow up a mainframe, and you can't talk like there's even in the Hiroshima earthquakes, several years ago in Japan, there were pictures of mainframes sitting on their side in the rubble, still running. Even in some of the September 11th things, there was some mainframes, sitting in data centers and basements under the World Trade Center, still running, right? You just hear all of these amazing stories of these boxes that, they're just, what they're flipped on, like they're not going down for anything, and you can rip every last little part of them and put a new part in, and that's what it really is amazingly fascinating engineering, and it goes to show of like the passion that this community has, but then also such that attention to that detail and just the philosophy of how each machine is built. I mean, think about like how many technologies that are built aligned with a philosophy. Like mainframe's been done. That's how they built. They said, we want a machine that's zero downtime and that is the most wicked fast throughput known to man, and all of these things all in one. And they build every machine like that to immense detail. It's remarkable, really, and that's why you see like such large organizations that need that. That's what they go to use.
And for developers listening, this is a skill set that's in demand.
Oh God, yeah.
Get involved with mainframes. Learn about this, because this is something that even if you're like a K native or you're front end or back end, having this as part of your skill set makes you very hireable and desirable to enterprise companies.
Absolutely. And you know what the technology that really is hot right now? Cobalt.
Yeah.
And you think I'm laughing, but right at the top of you think of it, right at the beginning of the pandemic, all of these employment systems, from all these state and local governments started crashing all over the place, and like, we need Cobalt programmers to save us because these systems are not maintained. Funny stories. It turns out the majority of those, it wasn't the Cobalt system in the background; it was the front end web system that didn't scale right. But we'll let that slide for now. But that's still an area of skill sets needed. Now, truth be told, there is tons of skills in the Cobalt space, and there's tons of technology people in there. With the mainframe project, right after kind of all of that hit the fan in April of 2020, we made a call out to the Cobalt community. We launched a free Cobalt training course that was completely open source, so somebody could take it, download it, do it with all of the lab exercises. And that project has really grown very nicely over time. I think the project had like almost 1,000 stars on GitHub before all of the training materials were actually uploaded. Like that's how popular it was. But at the same time, we went to the Cobalt world and we said, hey, you know what? The world says there's no Cobalt talent. If you're available, the world needs you. And by God, within like a couple months, we had well over 1,000 people that raised their hand and said, hey, I'm available. So and not just like, retirees thinking, I just need something to do, might as well make a few bucks off this pandemic. No, these were people all over ranges of their career, new, old, middle, all over the world, genders, races, ethnicities, everything. Like it was just split all over the place. So it really goes to show, and technologies like Cobalt, again, there's so much investment has happened in them, and it's not just a sunk cost fallacy that's keeping them going alive, but it's really, they're the best tool for the job that they're trying to solve. There's been tons of effort in many cases to rewrite Cobalt applications, and a lot of times it ends up halting because, one thought is like, okay, the budgetary ran over, we're not going to do it. But the real reality is Cobalt solves the problem they're trying to solve, and it does it really eloquently. So it's, if you're sitting out there in the audience and you're thinking, okay, maybe my Google interview fell through, I'm still trying with their IBM, I'm going to send an email to, my boy Luke here, and he's going to hook me up. But if those don't come through, you have motion picture jobs, probably definitely energy jobs, and you've got mainframe jobs. And some of the mainframe jobs are the highest hiring software jobs coming out of college for students from a salary perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine. Interestingly, Cobalt actually got me into programming. Real quick aside, our drummer got a job doing Cobalt for Y2K, and then he got a computer, and I'm like, oh, what's this internet thing? And that's how I got into programming.
Cobalt's not a hard language. Like it's literally something you could probably spend a couple weeks and kind of pick up the base, because it's written in, people get annoyed with it because it's not like, languages that we might be used to, like a C or, a Java or, Perl Python. Because it came out of the business information schools, it's written more like English language. So it kind of like, freaks out all of us like right-brained CS students. But by the same token, it makes the understanding and getting to know it and learn it a lot easier. So it's really, if you haven't, it's a language that's not that hard to pick up.
Yeah. So we are, again, an hour just whips on by. I want to make sure, so we got some GitHub links up here. If folks want to get involved, they can, dig into the code in GitHub here. And any other advice for folks who want to get involved in the three organizations we've talked about?
I mean, everything that happens is out in the open in these. Go check out the code base. Go look at the projects. All of them, have great contribution guides. They have ways that you can get in their mailing lists and Slack channels and just kind of learn and, gauge from the community. All of these projects are looking for people who are interested in jumping in and helping. And that's not necessarily that you have to know all of the answers, but, having more folks come into these projects is really what helps them thrive and grow. And that's sort of the thing with open source and projects like this. It's you get involved, you start working these projects, and you're looking to build a career. Your career kind of launches from there because employers are going back and looking in those projects to find talent. I mean, that's happened for eons in the Node.js community, and in certainly the CNCF and Kubernetes communities as well. So I would just really encourage you, check them out, start playing with it, jump in some of the forums, jump in the Slack channels, and learn. And I see here up on the screen, I don't think anybody guessed the dang movie, did they? Nobody put it in there.
Yeah, we got a few guesses. My colleague, Chris Ferris, guessed on Twitter, 6 Sense. I let him know that was not the one, but that's a good
try,
guess.
Chris. Good try, Chris.
Good try. Would you like to reveal the top, of the top 170 grossing movies of all time, which one, John Mertic, has no special effects?
There'll be some ABBA fans in the room that will love this, but it's Mamma Mia.
Ah.
2 M's in the Mama, by the way. But
I was wondering, yeah. Oh, well.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, that's exciting. This is all really exciting stuff. LF has so much amazing stuff going on, and I really appreciate you coming out and hanging out with us. And the invite's open to come back again, and we'll talk more.
Absolutely. It's a blast chatting with you both. It's been a long time since I've seen both of you in person, so this is close to the next best thing, but hopefully you're together. And really thank you for both of just running podcasts like this, because they can be thankless jobs, but you're showcasing some amazing technology and technologists out there. And I just want to thank you all for doing that work.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate it.
Cool. Well, cheers, everybody. See you next time.
See you next time.
Yeah.